Good evening, everyone. Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, watch us live in Facebook and YouTube. This is Rudra Narayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. Welcomes you all to this global digital platform of intellectual gathering of World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021, organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, Odisha. The broader theme of this conference is egnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences and policy frames. On behalf of CARD, I extend my profound gratitude to our respected patrons, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Dr. Sharat Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, Professor Sanjay Kumar Naik, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, and the respected conveners of this largest virtual conference are eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahiji. Before going to introduce our speaker of the day, I would like to share some words about CARD. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development, CARD, is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century's globe is facing today. Prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D, like debate, dialogue, and discussion, and with expertise, experiencing, and education, E3. The institution focus on marginalized communities and works for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, and language and identity in particularly. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomenon for societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodological and avoid paradoxically frameworks which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The CARD sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and builds new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps to plan accordingly for voiceless communities, for beneficiaries direct in self-reflecting global South societies. Now, I would like to introduce today's speaker. He is a very important and very flexible personality and a very important sociologist of the 21st century. He is none other than Professor Alan Goldberg. Professor Charles Alan Goldberg is a sociologist affiliated with the Center for German and European Studies at the George L. Moshe Lawrence A. Winston Center for Jewish Studies and the George L. Moshe Program in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He specialized in social theory, comparative historical sociology, and political sociology. Professor Goldberg was educated at New College of Florida, where he received a BA in philosophy and sociology, and the New School for Social Research, where he earned his doctorate. He joined the faculty in the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2001. In 2007, he was promoted to the rank of associate professor with tenure, and in 2012, he was promoted to a full-time professor. He has also been a visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a member of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, and a visiting fellow at the Advanced Research Collaborative and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Hence, Wissen's-Craft College, Max Weber College for Culture and Socialization, Sclaplip Studies, and Institute for Research in the Humanities and at University of Wisconsin-Madison, United States of America. Professor Goldberg is one of the finest mind of our time and a great sociologist whose work is highly appreciated over especially in Jewish studies. So without taking much time, I would like to invite Professor Goldberg. Professor Goldberg will be deliver his talk on the role of public university in a domestic society, lessons of the Wisconsin experience. Like now, I would like to invite Professor Goldberg.
Hello, thank you, Rudranand Das, and thank you, Professor Goldberg. Now I'd like to request Srijukta Charudatta Panigrai to go for a opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rudravu, and thank you, Dr. Jana. Good evening. Good evening, Professor. I don't know which time zone you are in. And good evening, everyone in this platform. This topic is extremely intelligent, relevant, and pertinent. Why pertinent? Because the role of universities, public universities, in democratic society couldn't have been more appropriate than this time for a discussion on such a subject. Because on one hand, when we say it's a public institution or a public university, what does it mean? It means it has got everything to do with people. It's public. And when we talk about democratic society, it's again everything to do with the people. It's involvement with the people, of the people, by the people. Now, if it's so people-centric, we have noticed that over the years, universities have drifted away from the communities. That's a trend which we've seen, because universities are more to do with theorizing. When with the changes, with the different issues coming up in the society, we need a lot of practical, action-based, community-centric theorizing or community-centric practices to happen in the universities. And that's unfortunately not happening in many cases. I'm not saying in all the cases, because it's incorrect to say this and take a broader brush and say that all the universities or all the public universities are not doing this. No, that will be incorrect. But what I'm trying to say here is that the gap between the public universities and democratic society needs to be bridged. Because unless we do that, we will not have the centers of excellence or the centers of learning. It's very easy to say center of excellence, but what does it mean? Center of excellence means that we bring or we draw upon the experiences from the society, the issues from the society, the dynamics from the society, plow that back to the academic institution, the university, and then in turn, take out from the lab. We should see universities as a laboratory where we have the best of the minds and where we have the best of the grooming of the minds to take out solutions, to take out directions, to again give that back to the society. So it's a to and fro, back and forth relationship with the society. And that's where you have the exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, and exchange of deliberations happening and giving results. So universities, relationships with the society is is of utmost importance when now we are talking about the various dynamics, the various changes, the various completely cataclysmic changes that's happening all around us. Imagine a pre-COVID life with a post-COVID life. Imagine what's going to happen again tomorrow. So there are so many rapid changes happening around us. The universities also have to breathe, have to live, have to be equally fast and equally agile. So when the agility comes into the public universities, they can match up to, certainly they can match up to the ever-changing dynamics of the society, of the democratic society. And change is the only constant, we know that. But are the universities bracing up? Do the universities have the capacity to brace up to the changes of the society? Do we need to help the universities brace up more? Do we need to help the universities come up with innovations, come up with new creative ideas and thoughts about making universities more suitable for the democratic society? This is all what we have to think. And this is where we want Professor to give us his insights today. That will help us a lot, because as Professor Rudra has already mentioned, that this is probably this is the biggest webinar, the biggest academic webinar, where we invite practitioners, where we invite academicians, where we invite all the stakeholders from the different sections of the society. So this is essentially a microcosm of the democratic society that we are talking about, this platform. And Professor is coming from one of the most reputed universities, and he himself has a long outstanding career. So we are all eager to listen to you, Professor, and take this back to where we were, and of course, bridge the gap between university and democratic society. And that's where we think, I believe that that's where we are heading to, and that's where we're actually going to contribute to the development of the society. And that's the overarching goal of all of us here this evening. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor.
Well, gentlemen, colleagues, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I really appreciate it. I also want to thank Dr. Bikram Kishore Jena for the invitation to speak today at this webinar series. And of course, to all of you for attending and being present here. I'm really delighted to be here with you, and I look forward to our conversation together. As I was thinking about our discussion this morning here in Wisconsin, it's morning. I realize it's evening for you. As I was thinking about the discussion earlier this morning, I was thinking, well, of course, as everyone knows, India is the world's largest democracy. And so I think I'm especially excited to be exchanging ideas with you today. And I'm sure that I will have something to learn from all of you as well about your experiences with public universities and a democratic society. So I really look forward to the conversation today. If it's okay with all of you, I'm going to share my screen. I have some PowerPoint slides that I've prepared to accompany the lecture today. So let me see if I can do that. All right. And can you all see that? Hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to presume that you can see that. My lecture, as you've heard already, my lecture will address the role of the public university in a democratic society. This picture, by the way, that you see, this is my university. This is the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the sun setting on Lake Mendota. So you get a little sense of what it looks like. So the lecture will be based on a new book that I've edited. The book is entitled, let's see if I can move forward here. There we go. The book is entitled Education for Democracy, Renewing the Wisconsin Idea. It was published in November 2020 by the University of Wisconsin Press. The book is about one conception of the public university's role in a democratic society. And that conception, which came to be known as the Wisconsin Idea, emerged in a particular time and place, but has more general relevance because the problems that it addressed are confined neither to the state of Wisconsin nor to the past. It is a conception that has been severely undermined in our own time in the 21st century by forces hostile to it. But I think for that very reason, it is more timely than ever. Now, since the Wisconsin Idea will likely be unfamiliar to you, I'll begin by providing a little bit of historical background. I will then tell you about recent attacks on the Wisconsin Idea and the efforts of students and educators at my university to defend it from those attacks. And lest you think that my concerns are parochial, I'll conclude with a few words about the relevance of this conflict for students and educators outside of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin experience, I will suggest, contains important lessons for other embattled public universities elsewhere in the world. So first, a little bit about where this idea originated. The state of Wisconsin was admitted to the Union as the 30th of America's 50 states in the year 1848, so about 20 years before the founding of Ravenshaw College. Located in the north central part of the country, Wisconsin has an area of nearly 170,000 square kilometers and a population of nearly 6 million. So it's larger than the state of Odisha in size, but much smaller in population. About 90% of Wisconsin's population is of Northern European origin. Descendants of German immigrants are the most numerous, followed by people of Irish, Polish, Scandinavian, and British heritage. African Americans are the largest minority group. They represent about 6% of the population and mostly reside in Milwaukee, which is the state's one large metropolitan city. Native Americans, that's to say the descendants of the indigenous inhabitants of Wisconsin, now represent less than 1% of the population. Many reside in or near Milwaukee, but most live in several Native American reservations that are spread out across the state. The state's economy includes three main components: a manufacturing and industrial belt in the southeast part of the state, dairy agriculture in the southern 2/3 of the state, and tourism and recreational activity in the state's sparsely settled northern forest and lake country. And if you take a look at this small map in the upper left-hand side, that gives you a sense of where the state of Wisconsin is within the United States. So you can see the sort of north central location of Wisconsin in the country. The University of Wisconsin was established in 1848, as I mentioned, the same year that Wisconsin was admitted to statehood. And it is located in the state capital, which is the city of Madison. So here you have a nice picture of the state capital, Madison. The Capitol building is sort of there in the distance, that dome that you see in the distance. And then toward the foreground are the buildings of the university. The flagship campus in Madison is now about 3.8 square kilometers and has a student enrollment of more than 45,000. Now, the earliest published reference to the Wisconsin idea seems to have appeared in 1889. But as you can see here, references to it peaked in the 1910s when Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States, hailed Wisconsin as a laboratory for social and political reform and urged Americans all through the Union, in his words, to learn the Wisconsin lesson of scientific popular self-help. And references peaked again in the 1950s after Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic Party's nominee for US president in 1952, invoked the Wisconsin idea during his national election campaign. So that's that large peak there in the center in the 1950s. You'll also notice that there's a much smaller rise after the year 2010, and that will become apparent why that's so in the course of my lecture today. So what is the Wisconsin idea? What does it mean? We can distinguish two ways of defining it. A narrow definition that emphasizes the university's public service or service to the state, and a broader definition that encompasses the political dimension of the Wisconsin idea. Now, I'll start with the narrow definition, but I think it cannot be easily or neatly separated from the political dimension. I also think this connection helps us to understand why the Wisconsin idea has come under attack in recent years and what's at stake in those attacks. Public service is the reason for the existence of the University of Wisconsin, which means it has a responsibility to promote the general or public interest. Historian David Hovler has traced the core of this idea to John Bascom, an early president of the University of Wisconsin in the late 19th century. Bascom emphasized that public education created a reciprocal obligation of public service. And to prepare students for public service, Bascom promoted a particular kind of education. He promoted a broad education that included the humanities and the social sciences to provide a wide, inclusive vision of life and society. He thought that that kind of education was really indispensable if students were going to be prepared to engage in public service. Now, eventually, over time, the university's public service mission came to include three main elements. The first is the contribution that the faculty have made to the state government by serving on administrative commissions or in other public offices, or by providing knowledge, expertise, and policy advice to elected officials. As Stevenson put it during his election campaign in 1952, the Wisconsin tradition meant more than a simple belief in the people. It also meant a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society. The second element is the university's outreach and extension activities, which serve the wider public and not just the students on campus. As University President Charles Van Hise put it in the early 20th century, a very large fraction of the work of the university is done not for the students who are here on campus, but for the millions of people of the state. That's how Van Hise put it in the early 20th century. And the third element is a strong commitment to academic freedom and the pursuit of truth, which is, of course, essential for effective social inquiry into shared problems, problems that we face together. The university's Board of Regents famously affirmed this commitment in 1894 after the economics professor, Richard Eddy, was attacked for promoting socialism and trade unionism. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, the Regents declared, we believe the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. Now, some of this will, I'm sure, sound familiar to you. The notion of public service, after all, is not unique or peculiar to the University of Wisconsin. Many other public universities also claim a public service mission. My colleague Gwen Drury has argued that what distinguished the University of Wisconsin is not its commitment to public service, but the way in which this mission was historically understood and practiced. The architects, Drury emphasizes in particular the democratic conception or vision of that public service mission. The architects of the Wisconsin idea, she wrote, wanted to make sure that conditions in the state did not allow a shift of power away from the broadest number of citizens and toward a limited group of powerful, moneyed people. Instead, they sought to create conditions in which all citizens would be prepared and feel confident in their ability to fully participate in a true democracy and a prosperous economy. Now, this emphasis on democracy points to the broader political dimension of the Wisconsin idea that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. To understand this dimension, we had to situate the Wisconsin idea in its historical context, and especially in relation to the social forces against which it was directed. The Wisconsin idea was an expression of American progressivism, a set of reform movements that arose in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in response to the problems created by rapid industrialization and urbanization after the US Civil War. Prominent among those problems was an unprecedented concentration of economic wealth and power in American society. In Wisconsin and elsewhere, progressive reformers opposed the growth of large, monopolistic business corporations, which they blamed for most of the nation's social problems, as well as the corruption of politics by business interests. To combat these threats, reformers adopted 2 related strategies. The first was to expand the size, scope, and authority of government so that it might protect citizens from what the Wisconsin reformer and civil servant Charles McCarthy called predatory wealth. The second strategy was to clean up politics and government, which meant curbing the pernicious influence of special interests by granting power to the people and promoting honest, cost-effective government by apolitical experts. That was their vision. That was their idea of how this concentration of economic wealth and power and the threat that it posed to democracy and to democratic institutions could best be opposed, could best be combated. Now, guided by these principles, Wisconsin developed a national reputation for progressive reforms in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. The state pioneered a host of regulatory and redistributive policies to help working people, including independent commissions to regulate railroads and industry, the nation's first workmen's compensation legislation, the first state income tax, which was passed in 1911, 2 years before ratification of the US Constitution enabled the United States Congress to tax income at the federal level, and unemployment compensation in the 1930s, as well as good government reforms, including a legislative reference library. It was later renamed the Legislative Reference Bureau, on which the Congressional Research Service was modeled, and the first state-level civil service reform in 1905. Charles McCarthy, the reformer and civil servant I mentioned a moment ago, whose picture you can see here on the right, popularized the phrase Wisconsin idea in his 1912 book that took this as its title, and he used this phrase as a shorthand to summarize all of these ameliorative activities of the Wisconsin progressive movement, which included the activities of the university, but was certainly not limited to the activities of the university. And we can now see more easily why the university's public service cannot be easily or neatly separated from the Wisconsin idea's political dimension. First of all, university professors and administrators were only one of several groups that promoted the Wisconsin idea in the early 20th century. They formed part of a broader reformist coalition that also included dedicated and innovative civil servants led by McCarthy, political advocates of a cooperative Commonwealth, most notably urban socialists in Milwaukee, and militant farm organizations like the Wisconsin Society of Equity, and a group of progressive Republican politicians headed by Wisconsin governors Fighting Bob LaFollette and Francis McGovern. Furthermore, the university was only one of 3 institutional pillars on which the Wisconsin idea rested. The other 2 pillars were the state's Legislative Reference Bureau, which political conservatives attacked as a progressive bill factory, and several quasi-independent administrative commissions created between 1899 and 1914, which were supposed to provide nonpartisan scientific expert regulation. So those included things like the tax commission, a railroad commission, an industry commission, and so on. Together with the state university, these were the institutional positions from which the advocates of the Wisconsin idea sought to realize and to promote their vision. And lastly, I would say the university's public service role presupposed and implied a broader set of philosophical and ideological tenets. What were those tenets? Most importantly, the Wisconsin idea involves what the historian Stephen Bunker calls a Commonwealth model of society. This model posits a definable public interest that is greater than the sum of individual or private interests, that transcends all of these particular concerns, and that can best be achieved through enlightened cooperation fostered by public institutions. In this model, politics is a public activity animated by a shared commitment to advance the common good. Bunker's summation of this model is a cogent statement of the Wisconsin idea's underlying credo, but that credo is by no means universally shared. We know that not everybody endorses this model of society and politics, and there are other competing counter models out there. Standing in sharp contrast to the Commonwealth model of society is what Bunker calls a marketplace model, in which society and the polity are essentially arenas of competition for power, wealth, and status. The public interest is reducible to the sum of competing interests. Government exists solely to facilitate the private pursuit of particularistic goals and to enhance the opportunities available to competitors. And the role of politicians is to mediate disputes among warring competitors and distribute benefits according to the power of the contestants. So that would be a very different model of society and politics indeed. The Wisconsin idea also valued social investment, professional expertise, social efficiency, and a democratic and practical form of public education. Social investment referred to the investment of money and effort by society as a whole into activities like education and research that initially benefit individuals or private groups, but ultimately redound to the public welfare and eventually enhance the general quality of life for everyone. The aim of social investment was not to replace individual initiative, but to help individuals realize their own potential, thus ultimately benefiting the Commonwealth. Social investment required a partnership between the state university, which furnished the necessary technical and theoretical knowledge, and an increasingly professionalized state government. As the economist and University of Wisconsin professor John Commons put it, expert administration was, quote, the instrument which society must gradually forge and improve for using social knowledge in the interest of valid social purposes, unquote. The progressive reformers who championed the Wisconsin idea in the early 20th century believed that these purposes included what they called social efficiency, meaning the achievement of a more harmonious and fair social order, and cost-effective government through competent leadership. Proponents of the Wisconsin idea also believed that public education should be widely accessible and that educators should try to overcome entrenched divisions between theory and academic instruction on the one hand, and applied research and practical training of a vocational or technical kind on the other hand. If public education was reconstructed along these lines, the advocates of the Wisconsin idea were confident that professional and expert administrators would be answerable to a well-educated citizenry. Woven together, Bunker concludes, the Commonwealth model and the concepts of social investment, professional expertise, social efficiency, and democratic public education constituted the intellectual framework on which Wisconsin's service state was erected in the early 20th century. Now, the Wisconsin idea may have been born in the state of Wisconsin, but it didn't stay there. It was an idea that traveled. Both the general nature of the problems that the Wisconsin idea addressed and the ties that its leading proponents had to national and international circles of progressive thought and organization account for the wider significance that it acquired outside the state. Although Wisconsin undoubtedly borrowed as much as it contributed, the Wisconsin idea was widely hailed as a progressive model for others to follow. Newspapers and periodicals across the United States published articles on Wisconsin's social and political reforms and achievements, and University of Wisconsin graduates occupied important positions in government, public service, and education, where they carried the essentials of the Wisconsin idea to other places. As late as the 1950s, long after the progressive era in US history had ended, University of Wisconsin history professor Vernon Carstensen could praise the Wisconsin idea as, in his words, a term that has had and still has both national and international currency, unquote. Now, at this point, I've explained what I think the Wisconsin idea means, both the narrow definition that focuses on the university's role as public servant and the Wisconsin idea's broader political dimension. I want to add that the Wisconsin idea is not fixed. So I've been talking a lot about history here. I don't want to give you the misimpression that this is a fixed idea that has remained exactly the same over many years. The Wisconsin idea is not fixed, but it has instead developed over time. In my introduction to Education for Democracy, I talk about how this development is linked to structural changes in the organization of the university and state government, including the dramatic expansion of higher education in the United States after the Second World War. Furthermore, the Wisconsin idea has been a matter of controversy from the beginning. People in Wisconsin like to think of it as this sort of celebrated heritage that everyone loves. But in fact, the Wisconsin idea always had its skeptics, its critics, and its discontents. Hostile political counterforces came to power as early as Wisconsin's 1914 gubernatorial election and have reemerged periodically since then. Now, the critics of the Wisconsin idea have typically seized upon its internal tensions in order to discredit it, and their criticism often takes the form of a one-sided or exaggerated development of elements that the original architects of the Wisconsin idea tried to reconcile and synthesize. Criticism, in turn, has compelled later proponents of the Wisconsin idea to clarify, elaborate, or rework those elements as they try to give the Wisconsin idea more coherence, more internal consistency, and greater expansiveness of scope. Now, I don't have time to elaborate all of these points today, but I do want to highlight what I see as three endemic tensions within the Wisconsin idea. One set of tensions pertains to the university's service to the state. As the German sociologist Max Weber pointed out, the ideal of the cultivated gentleman, rather than the specialist, was the end, the purpose that higher education traditionally sought. Behind all present discussions of the foundations of the educational system, Weber wrote in the early 20th century, the struggle of the specialist type of man against the older type of cultivated man is hidden at some decisive point, unquote. Weber was referring here to what we would now call the alternatives of a liberal arts education on the one hand, and technical training to prepare students for jobs on the other hand. His remarks raised two issues, one about who was allowed to benefit from a university education, and the other was about what kind of education university students received. In contrast to Max Weber's Germany, the United States led the world in offering higher education to women in its decentralized and fast-growing system of colleges and universities, in part because educated women were badly needed to staff the public schools that became one of the bulwarks of American mass democracy. Wisconsin was one of 8 state universities open to women in 1870. But what kind of education did it offer to men and women? Did it aim to give students a broad liberal arts education or specialized job skills? As I've tried to suggest, the advocates of the Wisconsin idea refused to take sides in this struggle. They instead sought to integrate academic education, what Bascom called free and full education in the humanities and social sciences. They tried to integrate that with vocational and technical training. However, since these two types of education have different ends, they have remained in tension. And the question of the end of education is also related to the tension within the Wisconsin idea between professional education for full-time students and continuing adult education for the general public. Turning from education to the university service more generally, we have seen that the Wisconsin idea directed it simultaneously to governing elites and to the ordinary citizen. Since the needs of these groups differed, these orientations were also in tension. And finally, the role of the University of Wisconsin as public servant immersed it in politics, which undermined its claims to being a universal institution above the Sturm und Drang, the storm and stress of politics, and its close association with progressivism made it vulnerable to political backlash when conservatives came to power in 1914. Once the university proclaimed public service as its reason for existence, and then justified its ever-growing budget requests on those grounds, and boasted of its economic value to the state, Bunker writes, it could not escape retaliation by those who had different agendas or different accounting methods. And that point remains timely today. So all of that is under the heading of this first tension pertaining to the university's service to the state. The Wisconsin idea contains a second major tension between democratic self-government and the increased role of professional expertise in public affairs. And some of you may have been thinking about this already as I was making these references to expertise in public affairs. It is just as ridiculous, Charles McCarthy wrote in 1912, to elect a railroad commission as it would be to elect on a statewide ballot a professor of comparative philology at the university. Progressive reformers like McCarthy recognized that experts perform indispensable functions in a complex society, but they were less clear about how to incorporate professional expertise into democratic decision-making in a way that did not subordinate democratic publics to expert administration. McCarthy argued that popularly elected legislators would determine policy while experts would carry it out. But as Max Weber pointed out, the dependence of the public and their elected representatives on the expertise of bureaucrats gives those bureaucrats potentially enormous power. This is especially true in situations of uncertainty, when the need for expert advice is greatest. Furthermore, we might ask how a democratic society can foster and benefit from the expertise and skills of a university-trained professional class while mitigating new forms of social stratification based on educational credentials. And of course, Weber wrote about those new forms of stratification. And we might ponder how a democratic society can ensure that this university-educated professional class will not pursue self-interested goals while pretending to represent the general interest. While the architects of the Wisconsin idea tried to reconcile or at least balance the tensions between democratic self-government and expert administration, I would suggest that they remain an inherent feature of the Wisconsin idea. A third major tension within the Wisconsin idea pertains to the people whom the state's university and government are supposed to serve. These institutions, I have suggested, were supposed to serve the state of Wisconsin in a democratic and egalitarian fashion, advance the common good, and enable everyone to realize their individual potential and participate fully in the state's polity and economy. However, the Wisconsin idea ignored several groups in the state that lacked effective organization or political significance in the early 20th century, including women, African Americans, and Native Americans, newer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the lower socioeconomic orders in general. The historian Stephen Bunker suggests that in this time period, these are his words, quote, the tenets of the Wisconsin idea were almost exclusively of, by, and for white males of Northwestern European ancestry, unquote. This criticism taken up in the 21st century, ironically by right-wing detractors of the Wisconsin idea, raises important questions for the Wisconsin idea's proponents. Who are the people whom the state's university and government are supposed to serve? The original architects of the Wisconsin idea answered this question far too exclusively. However, these exclusions were evidently not inherent in the Wisconsin idea because its subsequent development involved more expansive conceptions of the people and the social boundaries of the state. The university's changing relationship to the state's Native Americans is a case in point. In a lecture on Native Americans and the Wisconsin idea given in 2016, my colleague Aaron Birdbear, an assistant dean for student diversity at the University of Wisconsin, pointed out that the university was established on land that was taken from Native Americans. Progressive era policies toward Native Americans were deeply injurious, and McCarthy and other early architects of the Wisconsin idea ignored Native Americans and their history. Yet Birdbear applauded recent developments as evidence of a new era of partnership between the university and the state's Native American nations. These developments included the expertise that the university's law school shared with the Ho-Chunk Nation to help it draft a new tribal constitution in the 1990s, effective outreach by the university's extension division, and a 2015 summit between the University of Wisconsin and the state's Native American nations on environment and health. Praising these initiatives as honest and sincere partnerships, Birdbear concluded that the Wisconsin idea was alive and well. My introduction to Education for Democracy explains why a new book about the Wisconsin idea is needed now. Already in the early 1970s and again in the early 1990s, as changing demands on faculty discouraged their involvement in public service, and as state government turned less often to the university for assistance, some university administrators and faculty members lamented the fading or even the outright demise of the Wisconsin idea. In the 1990s, Michael Joyce, whose picture you see on the upper left here, a protege of Irving Kristol, one of the intellectual founders and leaders of the neoconservative movement in the United States, and later the chairman of the right-wing Milwaukee-based Bradley Foundation, attacked the Wisconsin idea in the pages of Wisconsin Interest, published by the conservative Wisconsin Policy Research Institute and funded by his own Bradley Foundation. Thomas Leonard, whose picture you see on the lower left, a researcher and lecturer at Princeton University, also tried to discredit the Wisconsin idea from the political right in his 2016 book, Illiberal Reformers. However, it was political developments from 2011 to 2019 under the administration of Republican Governor Scott Walker that brought the most radical and the most effective challenge to the Wisconsin idea yet. The nationwide wave of Republican Party victories in the 2010 midterm elections brought Walker to power in Wisconsin and gave his party control of both houses of the state legislature. With a conservative majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court since 2008, the state was effectively under one-party rule. Under Walker's leadership, Republicans used these gains to cement their political power and systematically roll back the historical accomplishments of Wisconsin progressivism. Now, earlier in my lecture, you may recall I mentioned the three institutional pillars on which the Wisconsin idea rested: the state university, the state's civil service, and the state's quasi-independent nonpartisan commissions. Walker and his party weakened all three pillars. In 2015, Walker tried to change the state university's historic mission by rewriting its mission statement. He tried to eliminate its commitment to search for truth, and improve the human condition. And he sought to substitute instead the narrower economistic goal of meeting the state's workforce needs. So he tried to strike out the stuff about truth and improving the human condition and make the university all about meeting the state's workforce needs. A public outcry forced the governor to back down, but the effort to reshape the university's guiding principles did not end there. Walker urged lawmakers to pass a set of reforms for higher education that he declared would be analogous to his earlier dismantling of collective bargaining rights for state employees. The resulting legislation imposed deep budget cuts on the University of Wisconsin, depriving it of crucial resources needed to carry out its public service mission, diminishing the quality of education, and creating a rationale to close programs in the humanities and social sciences. The legislature also enabled Walker-appointed regents to weaken tenure on the grounds that the university must operate like a business and have more flexibility to fire faculty. As you'll recall, a robust commitment to academic freedom was historically an important part of the Wisconsin idea. And academic freedom is closely tied to tenure. Tenure is what gives faculty the freedom to challenge conventional wisdom, to test controversial ideas, and to question university administrators on issues of curriculum and educational quality without having to fear reprisal. Lastly, legislation passed in 2015 vitiated the sharing of university governance with students, academic staff, and faculty. In addition to undermining the University of Wisconsin, Walker and his party took aim at the other two institutional pillars on which the Wisconsin idea rested. Legislation that Walker signed in 2016 weakened Wisconsin's century-old civil service system, replacing civil service exams with resumes judged by the governor's political appointees, centralizing hiring within one of the most politicized agencies in the state government, and making it easier to fire civil servants without proving just cause. And the Republican-controlled legislature also attacked the state's independent administrative commissions. It eliminated, for instance, the state's nonpartisan Government Accountability Board that oversaw elections and enforced ethics codes, and it replaced it with new bodies made up of partisan appointees. Other legislation took aim at the broader political dimension of the Wisconsin idea, affecting every major policy area that Charles McCarthy discussed in his 1912 book on the Wisconsin idea. For example, Walker signed into law regressive tax cuts that favored the state's wealthiest citizens and generally rejected social investment, except in the form of tax breaks and public subsidies to private capital. Corporations were permitted to donate directly to political parties, and Republican legislators entrenched their party's grip on power by means of extensive gerrymandering and restrictive voter identification laws, which suppressed voter turnout and skewed the electorate. Walker and the Republican-controlled legislature cut state funding for primary and secondary education by limiting local school districts' ability to raise property tax funding. In the areas of labor, health, and public welfare, the Walker era saw the enactment of so-called right-to-work legislation, anti-union legislation in 2015, and a raft of legislation retrenching the state's social welfare programs. In the area of conservation, Walker moved to reduce the role of science in environmental policymaking and to silence discussion of controversial subjects, including climate change, by state employees. And he signed into law a series of controversial rollbacks in environmental protection to help specific companies avoid regulatory roadblocks. And some, as Dan Kaufman put it in his 2018 book, The Fall of Wisconsin, Wisconsin's century-old progressive legacy has been dismantled in virtually every area: labor rights, environmental protection, voting rights, government transparency. Indeed, it was the state's progressive legacy that made it a target for the radical right. As Walker himself put it, if we can do it in Wisconsin, we can do it anywhere. Now, many of the faculty and staff who work at the University of Wisconsin today regard ourselves as custodians of the Wisconsin idea. And together, we have tried to defend it in two main ways. One is through collective action, often organized by the American Federation of Teachers, the American Association of University Professors, and student groups. For example, faculty across the University of Wisconsin system, beginning with the flagship campus in Madison, where I work, voted no confidence in the regents, mostly appointed by the governor, and the president of the university system, also appointed by the regents, and a historically unprecedented and nationally reported protest wave in 2016. 2 years later, protests by students and faculty prevented the closure of liberal arts programs at the University of Wisconsin campus in Stevens Point, and members of the teachers union worked hard and successfully to defeat Walker and elect a new governor in 2018. The other way that faculty, staff, and students have tried to defend the Wisconsin idea is through public outreach and education. In 2015, a colleague of mine declared at a meeting of the sociology department, my department at the university, that the Wisconsin idea was at risk. Why not address the issues fearlessly, he asked, and open the conversation to everyone? The way to do that, he suggested, was to create a new public lecture series and outreach course on the Wisconsin idea. We were educators after all, and it was our responsibility to educate the public. Moreover, he added, a course of this type would boost the public perception of the entire university community. It would boost the morale of the university's staff and faculty after the political developments that I just described to you had severely undercut that morale. And it would deepen the pride of alumni in their alma mater. The public lecture series and course were indeed created in 2016 and have been taught every year through 2020. The book Education for Democracy is based on that course and public lecture series, and all of the royalties generated from sales of the book go to supporting the course and the public lecture series to keep it going. Let me close with a few words about what I think other embattled public universities can learn from the Wisconsin experience. Wisconsin, as you've heard, has been the target of aggressive efforts to reshape public universities, but of course, it's hardly alone. Right-wing think tanks and politicians have pursued a similar agenda for university campuses across the United States and throughout the world. What these efforts have in common is the attempt to redefine public higher education as a commodified private good rather than a socialized public good. The use of budget cuts to force reduction or elimination of politically disfavored programs, an insistence that universities focus on job training rather than provide a broad liberal arts education that includes the humanities and social sciences. And when it comes to the academic workforce, the aggressive substitution of managerial accountability for professional responsibility. The assault on the political dimension of the Wisconsin idea is similarly germane outside of my state. Wisconsin went from being a widely admired laboratory of democracy to becoming a testing ground for corporate interests and conservative activists bent on remaking politics, not just at the state level, but national politics in the United States as a whole. In this context, a vigorous public discussion is urgently needed about the university's purpose and role in a democratic society, the full range of ways it can and should serve the public, and the reasons it deserves robust public support. And it's vital that these questions not be left to politicians, trustees, and university administrators to answer behind closed doors. They must be openly and transparently addressed, as my colleague said, with fearless sifting and winnowing in democratic and informed public debate. Furthermore, I believe that the ideal of service to democracy, which is at the heart of the Wisconsin idea, provides a compelling countervision to the utilitarian market model of higher education that is promoted in Wisconsin and elsewhere today. While education for democracy is focused on the Wisconsin experience, it suggests important lessons for other embattled public research universities. First, I would argue that university leaders often think that they must adopt the market model of university purpose as a kind of protective ideology to legitimize their institutions to the taxpaying public. The Wisconsin experience, I would submit, shows that in the long run, this strategy has perverse consequences. It offers little real protection and instead emboldens more radical attacks on public higher education. Public universities are most defensible and most deserving of public support when they are genuinely committed to the ideal of service to democracy. Second, the university's public service, understood as service to democracy, cannot be neatly separated from politics in a broad sense of the term. The university's commitment to the ideal of service to democracy must entail a political commitment to promoting the social conditions on which that ideal depends. Third, a well-rounded ideal of service to democracy contains, as we've seen, a variety of internal tensions. In my view, these tensions probably cannot be resolved in any definitive way, and I think it's better to preserve those tensions, to maintain those tensions, than to substitute more simplistic and one-sided alternatives. And fourth, the ideal of service to democracy develops as it is reinterpreted over time. So we've seen this in terms of, for example, the more expansive notion of who it is that the university and the state government are supposed to serve. Although the ideal of service to democracy cannot be redefined to mean anything that one wants, neither is its meaning completely fixed by the people who initially formulated that ideal. And that is why I would say the ideal must be renewed and not merely conserved. I will end there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions and to engage in some conversation with you and to hear from you about your own thoughts about the public university's role in a democratic society.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very wonderful and very praiseworthy kind of deliberation by you. Now I would like to request Dr. Shravan Bragg to go for a quick comment, please. Dr. Shravan Kumar Bragg. Okay. Now I'd like to. Yeah. Please, sir, carry on.
Shravan is not there.
Okay, no issue, sir. Please continue, sir.
Okay. I would like to say something.
Yes, sure, sir. Definitely. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. First of all, my congratulations to Professor Goldberg for his outstanding book, Democracy and Education, that is exploring Wisconsin's idea about the role of university in public service. So this is a very good book. It can be an eye opener for the researchers and experts who are working regarding the functions and services of the university for the cause of education and state services. So, sir, I would like to bring your kind attention to a very historic act of US, that is the Morrill Act, which still has a huge impact on the US and the world. And it was passed as an act on 2nd July 1862, 160 years back, with the initiative of J.S. Morrill. and it was signed by the President Abraham Lincoln. It was a historic act. It was intended to universalize higher education, to champion the higher education institutions, and it allowed each and every state to sell 30,000 acres of land for establishment of universities and colleges, as a result of which 69 universities, eminent universities, came into existence in America, and many colleges of agriculture and mechanical professions came into existence due to this famous act. So this is not only for this act was very beneficial not only to US but also the entire world. The entire world was highly inspired from this act, which granted around 1,000 acres of land for each and every university. So it was a very historic efforts by US. Thank you, sir, for your talk regarding the role of university in making education transformative and serving the people with the idea of democracy and serving the state, particularly a democratic evolvement of a democratic state. Thank you very much, sir. Over to Dr. Bikram Jana, sir.
Sir, please read out all questions to Professor Goldberg as well.
Yeah. There are few questions. An important question asked by Subham Das. How do you look at the relationship between academia, activism world to bring change in the democratic society and policy perspective of the state, so far as the role of public university is concerned?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That is a great question, and I think it really zeroes in on some of the complexities of thinking about the role of the university in democratic society. A lot here depends, I think, on what we mean by politics, and what we mean by academia activism. So, of course, students and sometimes staff and faculty are involved in all kinds of political campaigns to bring about all kinds of changes. There are strict policies and laws in the state of Wisconsin that prohibit people like me, public employees, from using public resources for partisan political purposes. So I cannot use any resources that I have from the university. I cannot use even my university email account, for example, to promote a particular political candidate. That would be illegal. I actually think that that's a good policy and a good law. I would not want to see public resources used for partisan political purposes. That is one of the legacies, by the way, of progressive era reforms a century ago. But we can also think about politics in a broader sense. And I write about this a little bit in the introduction to the book. So, one way to think about politics is in the sort of partisan kind of sense that politics is about competition between parties and politicians. But if we think about politics in having a broader meaning, if we go back to Aristotle, for instance, and think about the relationship between politics and ethics, the way that politics is a search for the social arrangements that best enable individuals to pursue and realize the good life, then it becomes clear, as I was suggesting in my talk, that the university cannot be sort of hermetically sealed off from politics in that broader sense, right? If we're going to be engaged in public service, that is inevitably going to immerse us into political matters in that broad sense. And I think that is not only okay, but I think that's unavoidable. So I think it's a complicated issue, but I think a lot depends on what we mean by politics and how we think about the role of the university. So it's I don't know if that answer will really satisfy you. It's a kind of yes and no answer, or it's a kind of it depends answer. But I think in this case it's the only answer I can really give.
Yeah, there is another question regarding the ensuing danger to the 21st century world is the manipulated data of the infotech world. That has less importance so far as the objective truth is concerned. In the post-truth political world order, emotions play a pivotal role in shaping the voting behavior of mindset of the people. How does Wisconsin idea address the problems of the post-truth political order in which artificial intelligence and complex algorithms are being used to manufacture public consent in democracy?
Yeah, thank you. This is again, these are terrific questions because they're very hard questions and they go right to the heart of the matter. I agree that this is one of the biggest dangers for democratic politics and our time. I'm reminded of the Chicago school sociologist who also had ties to progressive reforms in the early 20th centuries. And someplace they write that democracy depends on people sort of living and thinking in the same world, that if we don't live and think in the same world, we can't even have conversations. We can't even have dialogue with each other. There's no basis for democratic deliberation. And I think that there's some truth to that. And there is this danger in social media, in this infotech world, as you put it, that we live in and think in the same world less and less. Our world becomes fragmented such that we have very different notions of what constitutes truth and what is true and what is false. Certainly, I've seen this in my own country under the previous presidential administration, and I'm sure you've seen instances of this in India as well. We can see instances of this all over the world. So I don't know that I have a solution to this, other than that I think we have to find ways to organize a democratic public in which people can engage with each other, and which people can deliberate with each other, and which this fracturing and fragmentation is to some extent at least overcome. And I think that this is one of the tasks for universities and people who work at universities, is to think about how we might do this. So, and again, this sort of I think underscores the point about renewing the Wisconsin idea as opposed to just carrying it forward or preserving it or conserving it. This is a problem that I think the architects of the Wisconsin idea in the early 20th century didn't really have to confront, or at least not to the same extent. I think to a great extent, they did live in the same world, and the structure, the organization of mass media was different then, of course. So the challenge for us is to think about how to do this. And again, I cannot say the book provides a ready-made answer, but I agree that this is a very pressing and very challenging problem. And until this problem begins to be addressed, it will really limit and constrain the ability of universities and public universities to play that public service role, that role of service to democracy that historically they have sometimes sought to play.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I would like to more brief about what kind of the role actual invented by these policymakers in terms of public institutions, right, throughout the democracy is concerned. And many as democratic countries, they have rightly mentioned how could the universities has been taught in many subjects and many beyond the boundaries of disciplines. The sense of 21st century, we have witnessed the universities are working for the governments as concerned. And if you see the very close fight between the public institution and the private institutions, and private institutions now looking very forward and pushed the public institution in a larger part of the society. And many universities are lacking behind, and they try to improvise themselves to just giving certificates rather producing knowledge. If you look back the 500 years of the world's universities, rather they should originated from their own agenda, and they try to impose and working through corporate sectors prerogative ideas. What is your observations, and what you particular observe as a fantastic sociologist? How do you suggest to us, and how do you think to forward and push to us about these critical issues of criticality?
Yeah, thank you again for that question. I'm not sure that I fully understood everything that you were asking, but I understood that this is a question about the relationship between the public and private sector, or public and private institutions. And it's certainly true that in our own time, private institutions and the private sector are often described as a source of dynamism and innovation, in contrast to the public sector and public institutions. I think that's what you were suggesting. I myself am a little bit skeptical of this kind of framing and this kind of characterization. It's not to say that there's no truth in it, but I think it's often, I think this kind of language and this kind of framing often masks, if I can be really blunt about it, I would say it often masks a kind of ideological agenda, which is a neoliberal agenda. And so the idea here is that dynamism and innovation then becomes equated with the market and the logic of the market. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a mistake. I don't think that the logic of the market is always superior. I don't think that it always provides better solutions than public institutions with their different logic, which at least what should be different logic, sometimes can. It's not to say that I think public institutions always have the answer either. One of the things that I like about the Wisconsin idea was that it always emphasized the importance of public-private partnerships. And it has sometimes been mischaracterized by its critics as a kind of statist ideology. So right-wing critics in Wisconsin and elsewhere will describe it as a statist ideology. They will sometimes describe it as a kind of unholy alliance between a kind of modern administrative and regulatory state and sort of professional scientific expertise. I think that's a misunderstanding of the Wisconsin idea. So I think if we really study the history and look at the history, we can see that this is not what they tried to do and not what they had in mind. And if anything, as the Wisconsin idea has developed over time, we begin to see more and more an emphasis on a kind of movement away from any notion of a kind of top-down model in which experts have all the answers and you tell people, okay, here's what you need to do, away from that model toward a more dialogical model in which the relationship between public and private, between experts and ordinary people has to do with a kind of flow, a reciprocal flow of communication and learning. And I think this is valuable, and this is something that I would support. I think it's still something that we should strive for. But yeah, as I said, I'm skeptical of the way that that public institutions are sometimes, I would say there's an effort to discredit them and their role in a democratic society through a kind of neoliberal language that attributes all creative dynamism to the market and to market logic. That's where I have some skepticism. Thank you so much, sir. And so the social obligation of the universities, in particular 1970s and 80s, and later on beyond LPG is concerned, what is the social obligations of the public institutions? Rather, they rapidly driven through the market agenda and policy, the hidden agenda of IMF,
WHO or World Bank, and these big agencies and big players. And how do you positioning these particular knowledge producing institutions? Rather, we can say it the robustic nature of this propaganda agenda of these institutions. And how do you believe the public trust doctrine and the doctrine of equality in 21st century, right? And last but not least, you are the right man. You can give my question's answer. In a 21st century world where we are living, when I was doing my MA, I just invested only 240 rupees per year. But nowadays, when we look very seriously upon these criminal offenses by these private institutions, they are getting not less than 14 lakhs for a single degree. If somebody is doing a heavy, hard degree, then what kind of degree he has get at the end? I think many of universities are now rather producing these criminal mindsets. If somebody is invested 14 lakhs and then after he did not get a job, then he must be in the field of crime. What is your observations and what is your suggestions to overcome these serious social issues as concerned?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I don't know if I can really adequately address all of it, but maybe I'll start with where you ended with the costs of higher education, which I think is a very important issue. As you may know, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about this in the United States because those costs have, over the decades, been increasingly privatized and shifted from a public responsibility to a private responsibility. So the cost, the burden of higher education has increasingly been shifted onto students and their families. And of course, in the United States, the form that this takes is that students increasingly find themselves in larger and larger amounts of debt by the time they graduate with a degree. And this is harmful, I think, not only to the individual students, but to society more generally. I think this really has detrimental, harmful effects for the entire society, for the entire community. And it connects very much with something I said at the beginning of my talk. So I mentioned that in the late 19th century, one of the early presidents of the University of Wisconsin promoted this idea that public education creates a reciprocal responsibility for public service. Well, I think that's true. But when the cost of public education is increasingly shifted onto the shoulders of private individuals, of individual students and their families, that reciprocity begins to break down. It breaks down because the student no longer sees himself or herself as the beneficiary of public good, of a public benefit. Increasingly, they say, "Well, I did this. I'm paying for all this," and so they feel that obligation of public service less. And even if they don't, even if they still feel that they want to be involved in public service, even if they still feel they want to serve the broader public in some way during and especially after graduation, a crippling amount of debt makes it very hard for them to do that. So instead of going, for example, into a career with nonprofit organizations or a career into the public sector, which may not pay as much as the private sector, they will feel compelled to go into the most lucrative lines of employment, if they can find employment, because that's what will help them to pay back their student loan debt and to do it more efficiently. So I see this as a serious problem that actually subverts the logic of public service and service to democracy that I've been talking about. And I would say also that this is, again, one of the ways in which we see a kind of a market logic, a logic of neoliberalism, coming to be injected even into public institutions themselves, even into how those institutions operate. So again, instead of being understood as a public good that everyone benefits from and that everyone should contribute to, education comes to be seen as sort of a kind of private consumer good and the institutions of public education are gradually hollowed out. So this is an issue where I think, again, we see that the ideal of public service, service to democracy, cannot be neatly or easily separated from politics. If we are seriously committed to that ideal, we also have to be committed to creating the social conditions which allows that ideal to flourish, to be effective. And one small part of that, but an important part of that, would be to make sure that public higher education is again treated as a public good and not merely a private good.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very appreciating answers. Now I'd like to request Dr. Shravan Bag to give a quick comment and also vote of thanks, please.
Yeah, I would like to request.
Hello, hope I'm audible.
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Das, and of course our speaker, Professor Chad. Sir, to be very precise and very quick, first of all, let me to convey the vote of thanks and our profound, regards for showcasing a very successful model and sharing a very lively idea, I would say. And I'm sure that all the participants must have been enlightened by your talk. Let me to take a couple of points that you have highlighted during your presentation, sir. And starting from the very first notion of democracy, where you say that it is not just a form of government, rather we have to see it from a broader perspective, from a broader vision, where we are talking about the very key component of democracy as a service to the state, which is very pertinent and very relevant when we talk about a country like India. And of course, US, which has been the pioneer of democracy, has always been a key and torch bearer to the rest of the nation. And of course, as we all know, that India is also, adopting democracy as a means of its governance. So it is very relevant to state and to penetrate this idea with its citizen. It is absolutely correct that the service to the state should be the key idea as far as the democracy setup is concerned. You have also talked about a couple of models and highlighted few points where you have talked about the Commonwealth model of society, and you have also talked about social investment, social efficiency, and democratic form of public education. During the discourse also, there were a couple of questions where participants have talked about the corporate concentration and economic slowdown and how this, role of university has been squeezed. But as you have said that as long as the concept and as long as the notion of looking at the universities functioning in line with a democratic setup could be changed, then only it can bring a desirable change. And it is absolutely correct, sir, when you say that it should not be just as an institution which is built of bricks and mortars, rather, and standing alone. Rather, a holistic perspective has to be built up where a meaningful dialogue and meaningful engagement of university has to be there with the society, with the societal process. And in fact, that is how the whole society can develop. And the case that you have shared with us has really one of the very lively example for us to all participants to understand how public university could bring a desirable and visible change in the form of government and in the form of societal functioning. Thank you so much, Professor Chad, for enlightening all the participants through such a meaningful engagement and very lively discussion. At the outset, we at CARD are very much thankful for your precious time and giving us a very enriching food for thought. Of course, it is even almost night in India, and all the participants will take a lot of things from your talk. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all our mentors, our advisors, who have always been there to help us, to guide us, and to steer this entire process of discourse, which is also one of its unique in terms of initiating such a global series of dialogue. So we at CARD also express our deep sense of gratitude to all our mentors and our advisors. Last but not the least, to all our participants who have been always patient and who have been always active in such kind of discourse, and they have meaningfully engaged themselves. Of course, in the days to come, we will continue to render our service, our selfless service rather, I would say, to bring desirable change in such kind of activities where we would like to take the help and guidance of people like you and many other dignitaries and speakers who are very reputed in their field. So with this note, let me once again thank to all of you, those who have been very patient and actively taking part in such a very lively discourse. Thank you so much, and have a very wonderful good night to all of you in India.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, and looking forward for future engagement also. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks very much. You too.